Erin Pizzey set up the first refuge in the world in the beginning of the 1970s, and here we're talking to her about what she did, what happened, and her story up to the point that she had to leave the country because she'd been cancelled. Erin, you started the first refuge in the UK. When was that?
1971.
And what exactly did you do? What happened?
To give a history, you have to go back to really 1969, when I was sitting up in bed reading The Guardian, and Jill Tweedy, who was a friend of mine, wrote extensively.
A journalist.
Yes, a journalist, very well-known journalist in
Yeah.
the 70s. And she was writing about this amazing new movement called the Women's Liberation Movement that had been started in America by a small group of women in Washington, and then had spread like wildfire really across the Western world. And it had these wonderful promises, and one of them I remember particularly was sisterhood would be powerful, women would stop competing against each other and work together to make changes. And that just sounded fantastic. So what we had to do, you actually wrote into the office, which was off Shaftesbury Avenue, Poland Street, I think. You wrote in and you sent £3.10 to join, which is the whole of my week's money I had for food. And then they sent you sort of roneoed a thing, and it told you to go to a local meeting. So my local meeting was in Chiswick, and I remember the first time I went was the first time in my marriage I'd been out without my husband.
Who was also very well known, wasn't he?
He was in television, yes.
Yeah.
He had to babysit. And so I remember going to this very imposing house, and this woman letting me in, and walking up the staircase, and there were all these posters of women waving guns, and also Mao posters. So I was upset from the beginning, because this isn't at all what I expected. And I had a background with the Communist Party, because my parents were posted to Tientsin, and at the time when the Mao was taking over the country, and they were actually arrested and held under house arrest for 3 years. And we were aged 11, my twin sister and myself, and we didn't see them. We really didn't know what happened to them, because there's no news coming out of China. So I see this Mao poster and think, well, what's that got to do with women? And then I walk in and I see a small group of other women like myself, all joining, and the hostess said to me, and why have you come? And I said, well, I've come because I'm lonely and isolated. My husband's in television, he's away a lot, I'm virtually a single parent family. There's nowhere for us to meet and work together to make any kind of changes. All we can do is meet in each other's kitchens with our children. And I think women can do better than that. And she just looked at me and she said, your problem isn't your isolation. Your problem is your husband. He oppresses you. And I just said, hang on a minute. I can stay home and choose to look after my children. And I see that as a luxury. He has to go out to work. And I said, I can see from my bedroom window, 8 o'clock in the morning, doors opening all down Goldhawk Road, which is where I live, and men coming out going to work. I think they're much worse off than I am, because at least my time's my own. So there was a dead silence. Anyway, I went home, and some of the women who were in the group contacted me, and we created a group. It was called the Goldhawk Group, which is the road I lived in. And they all met in my house. And to be honest, we drank an awful lot of gin and tonic and white wine, and mostly nattered. Then I had time on my hands because my children were at school, so I thought I'd go and find out about this movement. And I went up to the office, and it's a Women's Liberation office in those days. And because I was a secretary and I could type, I took on a lot of the work with answering all the letters. And very quickly I realised that this really had nothing to do with real life, because the letters would come in from desperate women all over the country, and they just rip open the envelopes and take the money. It wasn't as though it was going to be banked or anything. It was the cash they took, and then they threw the letters in a big heap in carrier bags. So I started to answer those letters, and I was so upset because I'd had this vision of a place where women could meet together with their children and share the facilities and make changes, which were really needed. The first and foremost was somewhere for women to meet each other that wasn't defined by your husband's jobs, because that's the women you tend to meet. So this went on for a bit, and then there was this discussion among some of the young women who came into the office to hang out about the fact they were bringing gelignite back from France. And I remember sitting listening to this and not just saying anything. There was this assumption, of course, that we're all on the same page. And somebody mentioned Biba. Now, Biba was a great big shop in Kensington.
I know.
It was a lovely place, and I used to go with my girlfriends and our children. And I had bought myself this large plastic, what was it? It was to smoke. It was a sort of long holder. And suddenly, here was this plan that they were going to bomb Biba.
Good Lord.
I know.
Why?
I went home and had a terrible crisis of conscience, because, any good girl, any of us know we're not allowed to sneak. I thought, I have to.
But what did they have against Biba?
Well, the clothes. They were awful. They were. Because that's all to do with, we weren't allowed to wear makeup.
It was all showing off, yeah.
Yes.
And you're not supposed to use deodorant.
Right.
And so I used to remember saying, I was joking, I said, is it politics to smell? And then laughed. I know, I couldn't.
Right.
But it was serious. Anyway, what happened was that I called the local Hammersmith Constabulary and said, there is a plan to bomb Biba. And they sent this woman around, and I said that, I've heard this, there is a plan to bomb, and she basically just thought I was a nutty housewife on the sherry and went off. And sure enough, and it's in the history of Biba, it was bombed. Saturday afternoon, they had to evacuate 500 women and children, and the poor manager went downstairs to the stockroom, opened the door, and it went off. And he had to be retired. I think he never really recovered from the shock. So, at that point, I was thrown out of the movement. I was sent a letter to say that I could never attend any, I've still got the letter, any cooperatives or collective meetings, and I was banned from all of them.
I think we're going to find this is a pattern of your life, Erin. You keep getting banned.
Well, no, but I think anybody does. I was just no platform before everybody else was no platform.
Yeah, cancelled as well, yeah.
Yeah. So what happened was that I thought, right, this is time for me to go and do something I really believe in. And by this time we had this little group of women, and we went down to Hounslow Council and badgered them, and we got this tiny, totally derelict house. I remember when I first saw it, I burst into tears because I had such high hopes. It was derelict. But Harry Ferrer, who was a really lovely builder, I asked him if he'd help us, and he helped us for nothing. And that was the little women's group and me. Sally was a plumber, so she was a godsend. And we put it together.
How many of them were? How many in the group?
6 of us.
Okay.
But we got. I mean, in those days, it was very fashionable. So we got loads and loads of hemp and made curtains. And then we painted all walls, and we used a floorboard we couldn't afford carpet or anything, so we just used there were really thick cardboard to put down and tack down, and we were open for business. We had clothes for people women and children to choose, and it was called Chiswick Women's Aid, and women were welcome with their children, and they're all entitled to have a key. Men were welcome by invitation. And as soon as we opened, to my shock, because I hadn't even known about this, we got a procession of women coming in who mostly wouldn't go to social services, didn't trust them, But we were a local organisation. They came in, and we were inundated with problems. I mean, problems like this. So a woman's given a train ticket to visit her man, her father of her children in prison. Well, the prison so happens to be in the Isle of Wight, so she can't. You know, so that we take up the cudgels and say, well, fine, you're going to have to pay for an overnight for her. There's no other way she can get there and spend any time with him. And all the other problems were the welfare problems, because in those days, Acton Welfare, you know, Social Security Office, they treated the women like criminals.
Really?
Shouted at them. Oh, it was awful, absolutely awful. And they had these big perspex screens that they sat behind, and you know, and everybody else just sat in rows for hours and hours, and mothers with kids, and everybody getting tired. So what we did is we got big placards, and we wrote on the placards everybody's rights, what they were entitled to, and stood outside with our placards, handing out leaflets. And then I started off inside handing out leaflets, and this little tiny man rushed up because he was the manager and said, "Get out!" And I said, "Carry me."
Did he? You had a lot of publicity as well, didn't you, at the time? I think
well,
you had
yes, from the beginning. Only the publicity started because in this tiny little house, a 2 up, 2 down outside loo, women started, just banged on the door, and in they came. And I remember the first woman, Kathy, and she couldn't go back because I got to know Wally, the husband. And I eventually, that night, she walked in, she showed me the bruises, and so I took her home that night. I couldn't believe it, because there was no one to look after her. So after that, women just poured in. I remember just saying to women on the doorstep, "How did you know about us?" And it was like, you know, it was like, I don't know, like a pheromone, I suppose. And it was an avalanche. So women were coming in and sleeping, the children sleeping on mattresses on the floor, and the women sleeping against the wall with their heads on their knees.
How many people did you have there at one time?
In that little tiny house.
Yeah, yeah.
56.
Wow. In a two up, 2 down property.
Yeah. So
goodness me.
And the children slept like little sardines on the mattresses. Yeah, and we managed. The local fish shop gave us fish. The local butcher gave us free meat. The vegetable shops gave us vegetables. And we cooked a big lunch for everybody, including the people coming in for help and just other issues. And of course it didn't take very long for Hounslow to take out the warrants for my arrest, because we had no permission.
No.
And that's where the battle began, really. And that's where the local press came in, because the children were going into the local schools. And they were very good. Richmond and Twickenham Times saved our lives, because without their support they probably would have been able to close us. But very soon it became a national issue. But you can understand, because the vicar was standing up on a Sunday saying that I was a marriage wrecker, and the Catholic priest was coming in and saying to the mothers, "You have to go home, you've taken these vows," and I was kicking them out. And yeah, I mean, it was very tough in the beginning. There was absolutely no support until actually Jack Ashley heard about us, and he
an MP.
Yeah,
an MP.
He came down, and he made the first discussion in the last 100 years. It had never been discussed, even though every single agency in the country knew what was happening. Nobody talked about it, because these were considered dustbin families, not worth worrying about. There's no votes in them, so you just basically pretend they're not there, and you dump them on estates where there's no-go areas. And so wife battering was epidemic at that point. So what happened was that one day this little man came in, and again, he's very small. He sat down, he said, "What can I do for you?" And we said, "We need a bigger house." He said, "We'll go and buy one." We thought, yes. Anyway, it was Neville Vincent, who owned Bovis.
Bovis Homes.
Yeah.
Goodness me.
It's a great big house in Chiswick, and we moved in, and we were overcrowded before we moved in, as you can imagine. But it was one of those very tall houses with a basement, and in we moved, and we spread out. And then we used to every morning we'd have at 10 o'clock. By 10 o'clock, when mums had taken their kids to school and things, we'd all sit down together in this big sitting room and discuss what it is that we needed to do. Men had joined us very early on. The first little bit of money I had, I employed a man to work for the children and for the mothers, because I passionately believe men have a role in refuges. They have to.
They don't now, though, do they?
No, they don't. Women's Aid. They're all feminist. Refuge and Women's Aid are feminist organisations.
Yeah.
They don't take boys over 12 either. Women have to make other arrangements, which means that most women stay in the violence. Because other arrangements means putting the boys into care.
Goodness.
I know.
Okay, so Bovis Homes did their very best for you.
They did indeed. And then that's when we started squatting. Because there was no way we could keep rehousing the numbers that are coming in. So we joined, in those days, it was a squatting agency. And
I didn't know.
Yes, and there was a squatting agency run by a poet. I keep trying to remember his name, and he called it the Rough Tough Cream Puff Agency. And he'd list every week, there'd be a new list of properties that were empty and could be squatted. We didn't squat any private properties. We squatted council-owned properties where they'd done up the properties and they hadn't bothered to let them. And we started in Hounslow because Hounslow was particularly bad. And we just squatted amazingly nice houses for our mothers and kids. And then we found out that the Palm Court Hotel in Richmond had 46 private suites. It was empty. It hadn't been used for years, so we squatted that one night. And that's the way we became the biggest squatting agency in England.
Who was sorting out the gas meters and things? Were you involved in the electric meters and the gas meters and drilling the locks?
What we did, because that was going to get us into such trouble that we would be, it's a criminal offence.
Yeah.
So what we did, because I'm an inveterate camper, I've camped all my life, and so we had all the camping equipment you could possibly want to move into any house. We had the cookers, we had the portable loos, we had everything you needed. And so we just moved en masse, and there was quite a very funny moment when Alderman King, who was the alderman in Hounslow and particularly hated me personally, was awful, dreadful man. We squatted a whole row of small houses, which were probably worth $1 million now, little cottages in Chiswick, and had been empty for a year. So we squatted it, and he obviously heard about it right away, which was fine. And as he had his people there cutting off the gas and electricity, because it was winter time, you could actually see the lights coming on from the lamps in the houses. And we had oil burning stoves, all of it. I mean, it was all highly illegal, but it meant there was a place for our mothers and kids.
So you're very used to annoying people, Erin.
Well, nobody needs more.
Of course.
I've done it.
Absolutely. No, I'm teasing you, really.
Because Alderman King would sit there and say to me, you can have anything you want if you will restrict yourself to 36 mothers and children. And I said, if I do that, how are we ever going to know what the need is? You have to know the need. It would end up, and it was just a nightmare, all of it. So once we moved into the big house, it was a question of absolute faith for me, because there was no other way. Because I'd walk home at night and get into the car and think, how am I going to feed everybody tomorrow? But we'd open the post, and the country supported us. That was our great strength.
So you were getting donations through the post, were you, to keep going?
So we'd open all the letters in public, including the ones addressed to me at our 10 o'clock meetings, and then put the money on the cash on one side, and the checks, and then somebody would be responsible for taking it all to the bank. And we worked from there, and it was just a question of staying alive long enough to make sure that eventually something had to be done. But I mean, that was the vision I had, but of course it's failed.
So what happened?
Well, what happened in the end was that in 1970 there were no refuges for the first 3 years, except mine, in the world anywhere. There was no concept. And then I wrote Scream Quietly, the Neighbours Will Hear. And that's what Jean Dutton's husband said to her when he was beating her. And she was joking about it, and she said to me, he said, and I said, well, can I use that title for the book? She said,
sure.
Yes. And I had a terrible time getting it published, but eventually it was published as a Penguin special.
Why was that? Why did you have trouble? Because people didn't believe that the extent of domestic violence.
Not just that, but because I was saying that from then, that it isn't a gender issue. You have to remember the women's movement, had reached England in '69. So by the time I was opening the Refuge, they were around, and I knew, having been in the women's movement, that if ever I did, and I knew when I opened the Refuge that if ever I attracted donations and publicity, they'd be there, because what had happened is they'd failed. They were so radical that women were not following the women's movement any longer. So they'd run out of their £3.10 of housewives' money, and they didn't have a cause that anybody would rely to. How perfect, a just cause of violence towards women by men, and a fundraiser, which has actually funded them to something like nearly 300 million a year, and that's taxpayers' money. So nothing for everything else.
You've said that when you were running the Refuge, you need to explain it more than I can remember, Erin. But the number of men who themselves were being abused, you put a number on it out of 100, didn't you? Out of 100 families,
what I said was, and this is how you get to the number. I said that of the first 100 women that came into the Refuge, 62 were as violent or more violent than the men they left.
Right.
So these are the men we're talking about. So as soon as I got the big house, I went to the GLC, and I actually said, I need a house for men, for abused men. And bless his heart, because the man I've got who was going to give me the house understood what I was telling him, and he did give me a house, a lovely house in North London, a big, comfortable house.
The GLC is the Greater London Council.
London Council in those days, yes.
Yeah.
And then what happened was that the first few men that asked for refuge moved in, and I assumed that they would do exactly what we women did, which is to actually roll up our sleeves, paint, decorate, run the house ourselves. Not a bit of it. They moved in, bless their hearts, moved into their bedrooms, they wouldn't share, and didn't come out and said, where's the staff? And I said, there isn't any, we haven't any money. You have to do exactly what we're doing. We can get you volunteers. It didn't work. I had to close it down, because I couldn't afford to run it.
No. How extraordinary.
But it's not extraordinary at all. Why isn't there a very powerful men's movement? As powerful as the women's movement. Why isn't there? Men do not look after each other. They compete.
Well, men will join a gang.
But
men will
take care of each other. They'll mostly ride bikes and compete, and they'll get together in sport and compete. Yes, individual men probably make very good friendships, but on the whole, men make their relationships through the woman they're with.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I've said this to so many men's groups. I've spoken to men's groups in America, all over the place. Just say to them, if I asked you to build me a house, you'd do it in no time. If I ask you to take care of each other and create a movement, it doesn't happen. Men are used to being chieftains, and as long as they're hierarchical chieftains, they aren't going to do.
And I suppose in a way this explains why there are some people now who are struggling to get the group to actually work together, and it's then they seem to be finding it difficult to get enough men to actually join this.
When organisations try to have a men's march, you're very lucky if 100 turn up.
Right.
So you have to have a hierarchy and somebody in charge for it to work, and people
possibly not only that. You have to remember that men are seen as weak if they can't control their partners. people laugh at them. They call them girls' blouses. Please say, well, why can't you deal with her? And it's very hard for men. It really is. And because there is no recognition, that's why I'm so passionate about the understanding that it's generational family violence. Boys are just as affected as girls. And you know, we don't do that. We just say it's men, it's men, it's men. And even in programs where men's are basically, Women's Aid run men's hotlines, and if a man rings up on the hotline, he'll be screened, which doesn't happen to women. He'll be screened, and then he'll be given a number to ring, and usually what it is, it's the Duluth model. And the Duluth model has been proven to be a total failure. And it's a horrible idea. It's feminist driven, and even before a man, even if the court finds him not guilty, if he has to go on the program, because CAF loves this program, he then first starts by saying he's guilty, even if he's been found not guilty, and then he has to address his masculine privileges.
But Erin, before we stray too far into the needs of men and women, it would be great just to understand what happened in the end with your refuges and the network you'd set up, or that had grown up around you.
Yes, it grew up, and then the feminist movement then realised that this was a cash cow, and they began opening refuges.
Right.
And it stipulates on their websites, Refuge and the National Federation, that they're feminist organisations, essentially run by women. Men are not welcome. Men can't work in refuges, and boys over 12 don't come into refuges, run by the feminist movement. There are a few others run by churches or good people, but the majority are run by Women's Aid. And so what happened is that it was, to go back a bit, 1974, I realised other refuges were setting up, and we thought, well, what we do is to contact the emerging refuges and ask them if they'd like to come for a conference, which we were going to have in our church hall, and we could all share our experiences, because that seemed the best way forward. The one thing the mothers and I never wanted was to create institutions, because we all knew what institutions do to people. So the invitations went out, and sure enough, it was a Saturday, and the little church hall filled up very, very quickly with groups. And this woman called Jalna Hamna, who had contacted me before the conference and told me, you know, that she was planning to come, and could she come and have dinner with me, and she talked to me and I explained everything to her. Anyway, she arrived with a posse from Liverpool, Leeds actually, and she had a microphone and a sort of sound system, and she just took over. And they'd start making all these propositions. Because it was so many people, and we all sat on a floor, and they were talking about, you know, what seemed to us had nothing to do with women. It sounded more like, again, the old Marxist stuff, you know, the proletariat, the working classes, and one woman, Jenny, who was one of the best women I've ever had, came into the refuge. She just stood up and said to them all, the only working class women you know are the women who clean your flats. So that didn't go down very well. And we just sat there going, decline, because they kept voting all this stuff, and they voted themselves into the National Federation of Women's Aid.
Right.
And so we all just got up at the end, because we couldn't go on listening to all this rubbish, and went back up to the refuge and sat down, and we thought, and we were talking about it, and I said, well, you know, we can either spend all our energy fighting them to stop them, or we just ignore them and get on with what we know that we have to do. So that was our decision, and really we had nothing to do with them after that. The one helpful thing, that there were some of them were very good women who were working in the refuge and understood from their own experience, because if violent women came into the refuge, they were very quickly kicked out, you know.
Yeah.
Or anybody with drugs, or anybody with alcohol problems. So we did find some who, when we had women I called innocent victims of their partner's violence, we could put them into the women's aid refuges, because ours became very quickly a therapeutic community for all victims of domestic violence, men, women and children.
Yeah.
Before we talk about that, how did you? Your current situation is that really you aren't acknowledged to have even started this going. Are you? Nobody.
I don't exist.
You don't exist. No. How did that come about? I mean, what? How did they stop you earning, and how did they get rid of you? Because that's really a horrible way of putting it.
Because they stopped you publishing as well, didn't they?
Yeah.
Yes, they did. Mm-hmm. Well, it was difficult for people to realise that in the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, the gender feminism. This is a feminist ideology, that it is men who always are the abusers. Historically, men have always abused women. That's why it's called the patriarchy, which is a meaningless word. And they infiltrated everywhere, because Women's Aid, having got these massive amounts of money from the government and Refuge, they both did all the training, feminist-based training of police, judiciary, everywhere. And your problem was that women could actually go and find feminist lawyers who, regardless of the truth of the situation, would actually take their partners apart. And there was no real justice in those days, and the courts really discriminated against fathers and family, and have done for a very long time. It is, in my opinion, family courts are completely corrupt, and fathers have a really hard time in any of those courts, including Kafka's. All the family agencies have a mouthpiece, which is gender feminism.
So you're left with not being listened to. The outcome of this is that you're trying to talk to people about what's happened, and really very few people are hearing about it, aren't they?
Well, they can't, because you can't get any articles published about it, because unfortunately the media, these kind of subjects, women's subjects, are left to women journalists, and they're largely gender feminists, and they won't touch me.
Do you still get hate mail and that kind of thing, Erin?
Not really, because I'm very anonymous. I'm 82.
Right.
It doesn't. It was bad before I left England. I fled England, really. I mean,
because of the trouble.
Really, because apart from anything else, I lost the Refuge, and I realised that the time had come to go. And actually, in a healthy way, there comes a point when you push to where you know that you have to go, because if you go on pushing, you're going to damage the one thing you're trying to protect.
Yeah.
So I didn't fight it. I just basically resigned, and thought to myself, I can't live within walking distance of my own refuge, because it was my life.
Yeah.
And I was married again, and I thought, well, fine, I'll go to America. And I thought, what I'll do, because I was worn out with trying to apart from all the looking after mothers and kids, was the fundraising, keeping it going so we could keep going and eating and all the rest of it, and paying for electricity and stuff. So I thought, I'll go abroad. I'd written non-fiction. It was all out of print, which was no surprise, really. And I'll write a novel, and it'll have to be a bestseller, because the only money we've got, like me, my family, and I had my daughter and my grandchildren, my only money was from the sale of the house. So it was sink or swim. So I went off, and we all arrived in America.
Which year was that?
It would have been 1982.
Right.
And we hired a big camper for all of us to drive from LA, because I wanted the kids to actually see America. So we went through Death Valley and all the rest of it right up to Santa Fe. And actually, it's because there I was, carrying my toothbrush and my flannel and my towel, because you have a little block of showers when you put your camper in a camping site. And there was the lady next door. She was hiding with her 3 children. Didn't get much of a break. So,
well,
what happened was then, it was such a relief not to have people picketing me and screaming at me everywhere I went. And I wrote Prone to Violence when I was there, and came back for the publishing of it, and then had to have a police escort all over England because of the threats. So nothing has much changed.